Good day, everyone. The paper that to present today is entitled Towards a Relevant Model for Reviewing Land Use in Trinidad in the Context of Industrial Policy. I originally began studying the patterns of land use change in Trinidad in 2011 as part of my undergraduate geography dissertation entitled The Current State of Caroni 1975 Limited Sugar Agricultural Land. In January of this year, I continued my research in the area in the form of my MPhil geography thesis, whereby I am seeking to investigate the causes and consequences of changes in the agricultural land use of Trinidad and Tobago. According to Hawthorne 1994, changes in the land use reflect the history of the people and also their future. These changes are also linked with economic development, population growth, technology, and environmental change. In addition to this, a correlation between land use policy and industrial policy, as both play a key factor in the country's development. From as early as the 1900s, there has been a steady decline in the agricultural sector of the country. This is coupled with the fact that Trinidad and Tobago is a nation that is blessed with natural resources, particularly that of oil and natural gas. As such, the energy sector of the country is the largest contributor to the country's economy, and there is a lack of heavy investment in the non-energy sector. The consequences of this change or shift were visible in the land use patterns, the economy, and the society of Trinidad. Tangibly, the changes in the land use patterns of the country can easily be identified. This is supported by an article written by Peter Robertson, 2008, whereby he discussed how the agricultural system in the Caribbean is losing ground. The paper was done as a synopsis of agricultural roundtable discussion on the theme of connecting, communicating, and cooperating to secure our Caribbean agriculture. In the article, he demonstrates that agricultural lands are being overtaken due to rapid urbanization, economic development, hotel construction, and tourism. As such, there are changes in the land use patterns of the Caribbean. Economically, it can be inferred that the country is focused heavily on production development policies that emphasize a traditional industrial policy. In so doing, the main focus was placed on oil and gas sector as the main income earner, essentially demonstrating that diversification of the economy is a goal yet to be attained. This is discussed in a paper entitled Productive Development Policies in Trinidad and Tobago, a critical review by Ramiro Moa, Anne-Marie Mohammed, and Sandra Sukram in 2010. The authors illustrated that even though in paper, the government has plans to diversify the economy, there is still a lack of investment in the non-energy sector of the economy. Instead, there is diversification within the oil and gas industry itself. By not having a developed non-energy tradable sector, this can limit future growth due to a lack of externalities in production, lack of forward and backward linkages, lack of learning by doing, and lack of local entrepreneurship. As a consequence, the natural resource curse might reflect past rather than present conditions, and the current success of the energy sector might be in itself a constraint for the development of the non-energy tradable sector. The social consequences faced due to changing patterns of land use can be seen in a steady movement of people out of the traditional agricultural sector. This will further promote a decline of the agricultural sector. This study is therefore important as it investigates what happened within a post-colonial society that changes economic basis from primary economic practices to secondary economic practices. Along with this land use study serves to highlight a need for a relevant model for reviewing land use in Trinidad in the context of industrial policy. In the absence of a government-supported land use policy, the industrial policy of the country will not be able to achieve its objectives, and the goals that are achieved would prove detrimental to the economy in the long run. This is because land is a scarce factor of production and it is essential input in industrial development. As such, there is an interconnection between land use policy and industrial policy. Land use policy ensures that land is allocated equally to all competing sectors of the economy. If left unmonitored, industrial development will take precedence over other societal matters, meaning there will be uncontrolled industrial development and not enough land to allocate to other competing sectors such as urbanization and agriculture. From map 1, it can be seen that there were several regions that served the purpose for agricultural cultivation within the study area. These areas are highlighted in the green. Almost all of the agricultural lands within the area, located within the area, were under sugarcane cultivation. The largest sugar producing area was seen to be that of the Orange Grove Estate. The sugar lands were surrounded by a network of both major and minor roads, which are highlighted using the red lines, and these include the Churchill-Roosevelt Highway, the Southern Main Road, the Eastern Main Road, and the Golden Grove Road. The purple lines demonstrate minor roads, and these comprise of Carney Road, Mousica Road, and Warren Road. In addition to this, towns were found to be within close proximity of these lands. The most sugar-based production towns were seen to be as Mont Plaisir, Warren, Kelly Village, Frederick Village, Dainsley, Aruka, and Tunapuna, and these are seen using the red squares. In Map 2, it was noticed that a drastic change occurred in terms of the number of lands designated for sugarcane cultivation. It was seen that there was no area that had sugar agricultural lands within the study area as of 2011. The only form of agricultural lands that existed within the study area can be seen in the area known as Warren, directly off the Southern Main Road. This is seen by the yellow circle. Upon venturing into the land itself, it was seen that the area was chosen to be the agricultural lands that were promised to the ex-colony workers. However, no one was cultivating any crop at this time. This was not the only change. Towns located to the north of the map had expanded to include the areas that had once grown sugarcane in 1978. These include towns such as Arima, Aruka, Tunapuna, and St. Augustine. In its entirety, the Orange Grove Estate was seen to have been abandoned in terms of its sugar-growing areas. It was now replaced by a town. In Map 2, the current state of the Caroni 97 limited sugar agricultural lands within the study area is seen. And this new map reflects radical changes in the land use patterns between the years 1978 and 2011. Changes in the land use patterns in developing countries usually result from population growth coupled with economic development. Increased urbanization is seen to be the main reason why the sugar agricultural land belonging to Caroni 97 Limited is no longer in existence today within the study area. And this is due to two possible reasons. As one, it could have been a migratory wave of people that moved from the rural to urban areas, which resulted in the growth of the urban areas. And this could have also been coupled with the natural growth that would have occurred in these urban areas. According to the National Report on Integrating the Management of Watersheds and Coastal Areas in Trinidad and Tobago in 2001, land use trends in Trinidad has been dominated by a steady growth in urbanization and housing development and uncontrolled settlements. With the removal of these agricultural lands in the study area for the establishment or expansion of towns, the economy is severely affected in the long term. One such effect is that within recent years, Trinidad and Tobago has experienced fluctuations of its inflation rate. One driver of this is the country's high food importation bill. Even though the country was not severely affected by the economic crisis of 2008, a country cannot continue to rely on food importation to meet its needs of its population. According to the 2009 COTE annual report, Trinidad's food importation bill is over US $1 billion, as domestic production does not meet the domestic consumption demand. In an article written by Primus et al. In 2011, in the period 2006 and 2007, international food prices began to climb in the United States. And the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, or the FAO, saw their prices increasing by almost 7%. In June of 2008, food prices on the international scale reached its highest in 30 years. As a result, food prices began to increase globally. Food prices in Trinidad followed the same pattern as that of its global partners. However, even though international food prices began to fall within Trinidad and Tobago, they remained the same, standing as high as 33.4%. This demonstrates that there is a greater need to invest in the agricultural sector of the economy, as the country is ever exposed to international forces once the country continues to rely heavily on imported food. But in Trinidad and the Caribbean as a whole, there is the view that the economies of this region are suffering from the effects of the plantation economy and the plantation legacy. Many believe that the mercantilist relationship between the Caribbean and Europe ceased after independence. However, the relationship of the metropolis to the colony or hinterland and the structure of the latter's economy, which, with some modification, has persisted to the present, Sudama 1979. Many Caribbean countries in the present are heavily dependent on European countries, the United States of America, or both for trade. The legacy of the plantation economy, created primarily by European capital, the exploitation of the region's soil and its people, and African slave labor. Insofar as it was possible, all economic activities in the region were geared toward the production of sugar and food for Europe's expanding working class, and raw materials for its industries, while almost everything else, including commodities for local consumption, were imported from the metropolitan centers of Europe and North America, according to Rose 2002. In addition, Rhodes states that this dependency theory helps lead to the exploitation of the Caribbean region as a result of outside political and economic influence. As an oil-producing country, oil is now produced and traded with the metropolitan country, as, in turn, food is imported in large amounts. Our heavy reliance on food imports leaves Trinidad open to outside and political influence, and Trinidad is now placed back into a plantation system whereby it produces oil, which is seen as a commodity for the benefit of the metropolis and not for the long-term sustainable benefit of the people. In some instances, the revenue generated from the sale of oil and natural gas is expropriated to the foreign companies that have vested interests within our oil and natural gas industry. All of the above-mentioned factors that serve to contribute to land use changes are naturally occurring phenomena. In every country, there is urbanization, population growth, and declines in the agricultural sector, as more preference is given to achieving industrial development. In many instances, fostering and achieving industrial development is seen as the best model for economic development. These factors are even more prevalent in developing countries. For these countries, even more so for small and developing states or SIDS, their challenge is to try to balance their needs with that of effective natural resources management in order to try to achieve sustainable developmental goals. A major hindrance to this in Trinidad and Tobago, within the Trinidad and Tobago framework, is the fact that there is no land use policy. Instead, there are several governmental agencies that are tasked with executing several policies that are antiquated and cannot serve to essentially dictate land use patterns in the country. Some of these policies include the Town and Country Planning Act of 1969, the Water and Sewerage Authority Act of 1965, and the State Lands Act of 1980. According to the National Development Agenda for Trinidad and Tobago 2011, one of the medium long-term goals of sustainable development pillars of Trinidad and Tobago is to formulate and implement a single and all-encompassing land use policy. However, the lack of a land use policy is coupled with the fact that the industrial policy of the country is grounded upon the increased investment and diversification of the oil and gas industry. As this sector is emphasized among what is generated, more focus will be placed on oil and gas and less on the non-energy sectors, such as agriculture and manufacturing. More people will become disenfranchised with the non-energy sector and choose to enter other areas, such as the public and private sectors. This will result in a continuing decline of agriculture and changes in the land use patterns for agricultural lands. As such, there is a need to develop a relevant model for reviewing land use in the context of industrial policy. One such model must be developed in order to be used as a tool to measure how successful the governments of the country are in achieving sustainable development pillars or goals. The characteristics of this model will be outlined in the land use policy of the country. The model will comprise of the use of geospatial data and relevant guidelines that would be used to track the patterns of land use changes in the country. In conclusion, there are drastic changes in the agricultural land use patterns of Trinidad from 1978 to 2011. This is due to increased urbanization, coupled with large investments in the energy sector of the economy. This is under the inclusion of the non-energy sector of the economy. Consequently, there is the absence of a land use policy for Trinidad and Tobago. This policy is greatly needed, and in its void, the country will not be able to successfully achieve its pillars for sustainable development. For that reason, a relevant model for reviewing land use in the context of industrial policy must be developed and implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Charles and Mr. Burhan and Ms. Ali for some very enlightening presentations. And just by way, before we start the round of questioning, just by briefly recapping, Mr. Charles helped us to appreciate the fact that in the petroleum sector, the negative shocks creates more volatility in terms of the prices. And then when we moved into Mr. Burhan's presentation, we heard about the lack of policies that deals with renewable energy, and with Ms. Ali speaking about some of the the potentially negative impacts of the diminishing capacity in terms of the agricultural sector. And I think in terms of, I was sitting there listening to the presentations, and of course when I heard Mr. Charles talk about one of the recommendations is cutting costs in the petroleum sector, I could almost hear the trade unions mobilizing immediately. Because when we hear cutting costs, we generally think people are going to be let go, but that is not necessarily the case. But I think the general story takes me back to a presentation I made this morning, in that we are highly dependent on a sector that is fraught with significant problems, and we're dependent on a sector and neglecting the other sectors, and we have a sector that we're dependent on, the petroleum sector, and we're faced with serious volatility issues, then it can create serious negative impacts. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I was very pleased that we have a presenter from the Geography Department, because in Department of Economics, we are now implementing, well, we have a new course titled Urban Economics, where we will combining the geographical and spatial elements as it pertains to land use patterns and the economic implications of these things. So I'm very pleased that we see that there's some synergy between those two departments. So now with that said, I would like to open up the floor for maybe two? Okay, for 2 rounds of questioning. So we would take some questions now from the audience.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all. Just a few questions. It's always enlightening and heartwarming to see young economists do these presentations here at COTE. There are a couple of things that I want to say, though. The paper on alternative energy, I didn't see anywhere, you didn't mention the role of subsidies in renewable energy policy. And I want to suggest to you that when you get on to doing the deeper level of work, if you don't consider the role of subsidies, you would completely miss the mark. You know, you don't want to be in the wicket batting, facing Narayan and play for. Okay. So because that's important. With respect to the first paper on price volatility, I want to say that the paper you would find the paper and your work to be far more meaningful if you were to, I think, delve a little bit into the other side of the equation. So you start talking about profitability, and in the end, you tell us that profitability is a function of revenue and cost, but the entire paper treats with the whole business of volatility in prices. And then it seems to me that the recommendations, whereas they may make sense or they sound good, but there really is nothing in the analysis that leads me to the recommendations that you made. The analysis doesn't deal with the cost in the refinery at all. So how at the end of the day could you tell me that the refinery need to control costs? What you have done is simply derive the solution based on the knowledge that you have outside. There's something in the environment that tells you that petroleum costs are high. And if prices are volatile, then perhaps we need to control costs. But the research doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't tell me where petroleum ranks in terms of cost. It doesn't tell me what the cost per barrel is. Even the decline in margin that you show, it doesn't tell me that that decline in margin is because of price volatility as opposed to increase in costs. And I say this to let you know that as a young economist, I think it is fundamentally flawed to walk your way through making conclusions on the basis of what is in the public domain, where the body of analysis that you have doesn't lead to those conclusions. I think it is fundamentally flawed. Yeah, and you will want to take a look at that. All right? So I don't know if you have a response for it. It's just a comment. It's not really a question. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to make a like a type of, it's like a question or recommendation in terms of the third presentation by Miss Ali that I enjoyed. But I just feel sometimes when we look at the issue of land acquisition or land use, that we sometimes see it in economics in very hard numbers. And what we sometimes miss is like anthropological methods, which might be very helpful in us understanding a kind of cultural economics that exists. So for the example, in Latin America, as it relates to land use in a very way that they respect the environment and preserve it. And when we talk about development, it's not about development both, but the ecological balance is always part of it. We saw the role that First Nation peoples had, right? In terms of making those contributions to the way that we understand, we construct the environment. And so in Brazil, of course, took a very important lead with that, right? In Jamaica, if we look at indigenous groups, we could include Rastafari and so on, right? And perspectives in the way people organize land. And why is that important? Because we have concepts like extractive reserves, right? The idea that you protect land as a reserve, but you could also create industries, right? Or things, issues like competitiveness and like things that are economically viable to come out of this place while respecting the groups and the cultural heritage of it. So we have frameworks like heritage tourism and so on. And I wanted to know, when you think of land use, I found it was very problematic when we say that either migratory or natural growth, and then we put the word urbanization. And it's very hard when you look at Trinidad and Tobago and you said anything is urban, actually, right? When we have a kind of semi-rural, semi-village, and we have semi-urban, semi-village, and you have tunapunas and sawas, right, that occupy different types of spaces. So it's not just about migration. I think in an island, people will always move about. If you watch the history of how people occupy land in islands, right, or the natural growth, it could only be so much. And the way that, I'm trying to say that, because this will tie, I think, inevitably into Mr. Boudin's work. What are the discourses on development and our philosophy in terms of the bodies and how people occupy land and our resources, which can inform the language in the way that we understand land or energy and the way that people use it. So it's like a legacy of consciousness that I really want to speak into, right, which make us occupy and or waste and litter and, or exploit, right?
Good day. My question relates to the presentation by Mr. Boudin on renewable energy. You mentioned that the current draft, which exists with regards to renewable energy policy, has a goal to diversify into other sectors, such as solar and wind. And you highlighted that wind may be the way forward. I wanted to know how feasible do you think it is to achieve that by 2020, I think you said? And with an economy that's focused mainly on natural gas and oil. You have countries like Jamaica and Barbados. Jamaica, I think, has 2 wind farms, and Barbados actually has solar, is into the solar energy. So how feasible do you think it is for a country with a natural resource like oil to move into that sector?
Okay, so I'd like to thank you for the questions and comments, and I'd like to invite the panelists now to address the questions and comments respectively.
Hello. My comment is to Amelka for his comment and question. In terms of Trinidad, we would see that our traditional land use patterns that will fall under customary land use patterns, we will see this happening in terms of Indian families, for example, where they would have extended families living in one plot of land, or perhaps extended families living in one house. So for an example, you have a family of perhaps maybe 2 children, and you will find that the 2 children will grow up, get married, and they will be living in the same house. If on the part of land there's room to extend, they will extend the land. Sorry, they extend the house. And also, like in terms of agricultural land, individuals of not of this generation, but of generations have gone by, they seem to preserve some parts of their land that will be allocated towards home garden or backyard garden. And also in terms of Indian families, there will be a part of the land that will be allocated towards a little temple at home whereby they will conduct their religious worship. And when I say land, I mean like a family plot, like one plot of land. In terms of when I spoke about migration, I just simply use the terminology so that it will be more easily understood when I meant movement from rural to urban areas. In terms of when you look at the figures for Trinidad, you see that we have upwards of 75% of the island being considered urbanized. And very small pockets of the island you'll consider as being rural. And in terms of tracking or anthropogenic methods that we would use to track traditional patterns in the land use changes, there's currently a project being conducted by the Department of Engineering, whereby one of the lecturers there is conducting a project whereby he is using participatory GIS in Tobago, whereby he follows individuals in Tobago and he goes with maps and he would ask them, in this year, what was located here, but he's really looking at forest degradation. Because as you know, a large part of Tobago is allocated to forest reserves, and that's part of his project. In terms of Trinidad, in my project, if I'm going to use participatory GIS, this will take me into a PhD thesis. So right now, I'm not really employing this particular tool. Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Maguire, your point is taken in terms of the subsidy. Yes, we need to find a way to include subsidy into the research, and yes, we intend to consider it in the research. We need to find a way how to massage this variable in order to accommodate. And in terms of the goal of the renewable energy, the draft renewable energy policy of 2011 Trinidad and Tobago, in terms of achieving this, it comes back to Mr. Maguire and the subsidy. Now, energy is so cheap in Trinidad and Tobago, one of the cheapest in the Western Hemisphere. So if energy is so cheap, why invest in renewable energy? So the point is that you need to create this enabling environment, and one way of doing that is not getting rid of the subsidy in one shot, but over time, and and also provide the necessary policies in terms of renewable energy, because we see so much things is happening in other Caribbean islands, but why not in Trinidad and Tobago? Because we have oil and gas, and this is one of the major deterrent factors of the island that prevents renewable energy development on the island. So the goal can be feasible at this point, but you need to create the enabling environment as soon as possible.
With regards to the comment posed by Mr. Maguire, I actually agree with the whole point he made that the bulk of the analysis was based upon price and price volatility. Now, in terms of the policy recommendations, the two major policy recommendations are regards to cost and trying to you protect your prices. How it is you protect your prices is regard to like hedging with futures contracting. Now, I know I tried to elaborate more upon cost, because cost is really one of the major significant factors in terms of Petron's profitability. But at the same point in time, if this is looking at the gross margin, you can actually protect your gross margin by hedging with some futures contracts then. And this research actually leads into our next paper, whereby I will try to compute optimal hedge based on the difference between, well, based on the ratio relationship between spot and futures prices. So you are very accurate, and it's like this research leads to an actual another study whereby actually come out with like a price or a solution for the volatility or the volatility in terms of the refinery margin and so forth then.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Okay, I'd like you to join me in thanking the panelists for their contributions. And